Welcome to the Coaching Collective podcast. So today we are in the presence of Austin Stout. So Austin is a coach located in Ohio of the USA, as referenced, 30 to 45 minutes from the Arnold Classic.
Right.
Anyone pretty unaware. So I've been following him for some years now personally, which probably the reason I took interest in what you were about was because you sort of went a little bit more detailed you had a bit of a, how do I put it? Like there was a health orientated aspect to the bodybuilding approach. So you were still that hardwired, like I guess bodybuilder and associated with those guys, but you still were very health savvy, and science savvy, which you don't see
Yeah.
too often. So that's what jumped out at me. But without further ado, man, if you could introduce yourself for those listening and give us a little bit of a background.
Yeah. So I have a couple, I have a couple cool perspectives, I think, because of when I started in the space. When I started, I was lucky enough to get in kind of in that gray area where we were still on forums and we weren't quite onto Instagram yet. So Instagram hadn't really well, for one, it really didn't even start for about a year or two after I started bodybuilding, or maybe 3 years after I started bodybuilding. And so I was lucky enough to kind of get that old school exposure on, way back on the forums, RX Muscle, Professional Muscle, like those type of forums, right?
Mhm.
So at my core, I am a bodybuilder at my core. I still compete. That is very much who I am. I am, I love to train, hardcore training. Like I train at my house. I have my own setup. I will always do those things. However, as I grew in my coaching and in my career, I, like you had mentioned, I definitely transitioned a lot into the health space. And that was more out of necessity, really. It was more out of necessity for myself because like a lot of people, I ran into digestive issues, I ran into hormonal issues, I ran into all these things from my own mistakes, essentially, right? I was the guy, competed too many times back to back, did that whole thing, burnout, had all the issues. And so my thought process there was, man, if I'm experiencing this, there has to be other people experiencing these things. And as I started to learn, I noticed that a lot of that stuff translated into my clients. So, it's like, well, why do we bring someone in and they don't respond when we take calories away? Like, why are we getting these adaptations? Like, why are we seeing these things? Why are we seeing digestive issues? And why are we seeing different magnitude of this in different people? Right? Because of course genetics play into that, but also that allostatic load, that accumulated stress that we get over years of doing this, like years of deficits, years of yo-yo dieting for your kind of like more gen pop person, right? And so that's where my interest came from, getting into that. What I guess, I hate the word functional health, but that's kind of what it is. It's what it's termed. Um, and then that took me down a rabbit hole of doing more advanced strategies, more advanced testing, like looking at stool tests, which are GI maps that we use here a lot in the US and some other countries, urine testing, of course, like blood testing, things like that everyone kind of uses anyhow. um, and then what I what started as like essentially what started as working with people, like general population people and things that had those issues, I wanted to bring that into the bodybuilding space, because you brought up a point earlier where you don't see people intermix those two things very often.
Yeah.
So I do a lot of mentorship with people that are heavily into functional health, and I do a lot of mentorship with people that are heavily into bodybuilding, but they normally don't do both,
Mm.
right? And I'm like, well, why not? Because as bodybuilders, we are the compromised population. We are the people that are, how much time as bodybuilders do we really spend in a homeostatic environment? We're either eating a bunch of food, or we're eating no food, or we're like really lean, or we're really inflamed. So it's like we're always tipping the scale on one side or the other, usually pretty drastically. So, I was noticing, okay, well, like why are people having issues in their off season eating food? Why do they not have hunger? Why do they have digestive issues? Why do they, why can't we lose body fat effectively? And so all those things. And long story short, that kind of brought me to where I am today, and being able to bridge that gap, I guess, if you will. So everything that I do is aimed towards, of course, being the best bodybuilder that you can be if I'm working with a competitor, but at the same time, considering longevity and also realizing that a body that responds better will get better results,
Yeah.
right? A body that functions better will get better results. Always. There's no argument there. I mean, you can't, anyone with any sense is going to understand that concept, right?
Yeah. I just remembered actually now that we said it off air, how I found you. I remember I reached out for a Hashimoto's consultation. Um,
Okay.
yeah, I think I may have reached out to Joe and then he said, "This is your guy." And then yeah, that was that.
Okay.
You don't mind me asking before I go on, how old are you?
I'm 33.
Cool. How many shows have you done as well?
I've done, let's see, one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, I don't know, a dozen maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Nice.
something like that.
Yeah.
Around that.
Cool. Just more out of curiosity. Yeah, it's interesting because you've raised a few points which most would neglect.
Yeah.
Even with the why do you pull food away, and then said client has difficulty still losing weight, so on and so forth. If you just before we go into, I guess what we've sort of planned to talk about, what are some of the reasons you observed as to why there are cases where you might pull food away in the context of a prep or in the context of just a typical overweight person trying to lose weight, and we don't see the progress we would expect?
So there's a lot of variables in play there. I mean,
Hmm.
one
That's
one
fair.
is yeah, one is that I think when I say stuff like that, I don't want people to think that I don't believe in calories in and calories out because
Mhm.
obviously if you took enough away, they're going to lose weight. If they ate nothing, they're going to lose weight, no matter what kind of adaptation you have, you know. So
Yeah.
there's not really an argument that thermodynamics is not how we lose weight and body fat. It absolutely is. The problem is that the amount of adaptation makes it so difficult for us to do it that the deficits become unsustainable. Then other health ramifications pop up. People end up binge eating because like they can't do it, you know, they
Yeah.
can't sustain that, right? So typically when we see this type of thing happen, so genetics play into this heavily. Like we know that regardless of what we do, there's always going to be someone else that could do the same thing and get 10 times the result. Always.
Mhm.
So genetics are by far the biggest variable here, no matter what. The second thing is we have something called epigenetics. So epigenetics would kind of, in a nutshell, and there's a lot of types of epigenetics, but you think of you think of the adaptations. So like certain adaptations we would have is when we diet, our T4 to T3 conversion, our thyroid slows down. Our leptin levels go down. Like these are things that are studied. We know these things happen to everyone. So looking at epigenetics, it's kind of like if we took a person and we exposed them to lots of dieting for long periods of time without sufficient rest, right? Without sufficient recovery or surplus, or like anything that increases allostatic load, like tons of environmental stress, training too hard without deloads, like whatever, right? Stack all that stuff on top of each other. And then we took the same person and we didn't expose them to that. You're going to have epigenetic potentially. This is a lot of this is theorized, but you're going to have epigenetic changes over time. So essentially, when you go into that deficit, it's the same adaptations occurring. They're just happening a lot faster. Does that make sense? Like they're happening faster and they're happening maybe harsher is the term. So like there's individuals when they adapt so quickly. I mean, it's like you can pull calories and nothing happens, right? Pull calories again and not like these adaptations are almost instantaneous, right? And a lot of that's because those adaptations are happening so quickly and so heavily in those people. And so, how do you fix that is the question. Of course, there's a whole bunch of things that go into that, right? Hormones and GI and all this stuff. But essentially, time is one of the biggest variables there, right? Like we have to have enough time outside of those outside of that stress load for those adaptations to start to reverse. So there is a little bit of literature that kind of shows these things with like people that have eating disorders at young ages, like in adolescence and stuff, and they see those changes into adulthood, or people that like participated in weight restricted sports, when they were younger, or gymnastics, or like endurance, like track, cross country, things like that. You see some of those epigenetic changes happen where they respond differently to those deficits and stimulus because it's protective,
Mm-hmm.
right? So time is going to be the biggest thing no matter what. And then of course, on top of that, you have hormones and things playing against you because of course, like these fat burning hormones become slower, thyroid production slows down, like all these things start to slow down. So root is time and stress always. Secondary is implementing strategies to actually fix the hormonal part. I guess is the like quick and dirty version of that.
Okay, so question you just raised, I found that super interesting actually. So you just raised the concept of like the gymnastics and like, let's just say an athletic individual, like across a lifespan. What with adaptations are you saying that they become more protective, as in the body will try to preserve body fat hypothetically? Or are you saying the
Yeah,
opposite?
so you see it kind of go both ways.
Hmm.
Um, you see it where if you've had someone, and we kind of see this in bodybuilding too. So if you ever seen someone that's bodybuilded for a really long time and they've been pretty lean for a long time and they almost can't get fat anymore? You know
Hmm.
what I mean? Like do you know what I'm talking about? Like they
Yeah.
almost couldn't eat enough to get fat. They would be sick of eating before they actually got fat.
Hmm.
So that's an adaptation, right? Because earlier in their career, they weren't like that, right? They weren't like that when they started bodybuilding. Now, granted, they have a lot more muscle tissue now, for sure. So that's a factor. But even then, we know that yes, muscle tissue raises caloric needs, but it's not like it's raising caloric needs by thousands and thousands of calories,
Yeah.
right? It's not that extreme. So that would be an example of that going in kind of the opposite direction,
Hmm.
right? Or if you took the example of the eating disordered individual, that's a really common one. I would say really common, but that's one that I run into relatively often where they've been exposed to lots of restriction. Like we're talking extreme restriction for long periods of time. So not only are their hormones probably shot, but not only that, they probably have everything is essentially slowed down in that system as a preservation, right? Because we know that as body fat lowers, leptin levels go down, thyroid hormones go down, all those things are protecting the person because, like, hey, we don't want to get any, like, we don't want to lose any more weight. Let's stop. So as those people feed up, you see something called, have you ever seen refeeding syndrome? So refeeding syndrome is there's a couple ways to describe it, but essentially in a nutshell, it's like they in post show is we were to talk about post show, and this is a perfect segue. So do you know when post show, when you start eating and then everything's very palatable, right? Like everything tastes good. And once you start, it's over. You can't stop. You can eat until you're absolutely sick and can fall over and they have to wheel you out of there in a wheelchair, but you just can't stop. So a lot of that is the body trying to essentially regain that homeostatic point as quick as it can. So what we start seeing is refeeding syndrome or like body fat overshooting in those individuals, right? So where those adaptations are coming up, but they're coming up way slower than the food is coming up,
Hmm.
right? So that's why if you've seen an individual in contest prep and then they gain back more body fat than they started with from the prep,
Yeah.
right? Like post show, they gain back more than they had before they started the prep, or maybe they gain that body fat back like 10 times quicker than what they lost it, you know,
Yeah.
right? Because in an ideal world, if you really think about it, we want to we want to accrue that body fat post show because we do need that for just to function normally. But you got to think, if we're gaining back, if we're already as fat as we were 20 weeks out within 6 weeks post show,
Hmm.
we're in trouble. We're in trouble for the rest of that off season. Like
It's- yeah.
we have like months of off season left. Like, what are we going to do now? Right. So we've effectively gained back all that body fat, but we haven't really had time to reverse those adaptations. So you see body fat overshooting happen.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's very interesting, the adaptations concept as well, because you never hear about this. It's not something that's really
Yes,
quantifiable in the typical fitness space either.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
when we did a podcast with, like, it's a whole different sort of concept, but when we did the podcast with Dean St. Mart, I'm assuming you know Dean
Yeah.
St. Mart,
Yeah. Dean.
and he was going over, like, it wasn't so much epigenetics, but just like cellular changes associated with PEDs. That was a specific concept.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of the podcast just what him we sort of just went over my head. I was like, I've never heard anyone talk about this. But when you dive into that, it's not like like what we're talking about here, what you're talking about here. It's not like it's making sense for the listener, because they're thinking, fuck, I got these things that I can't even control. But it gives you an insight in regards to how much more is involved than we're led to believe.
Yeah. And you're right. It's
Yeah.
difficult to quantify because
Mm.
like a lot of people like to cite research, and there's not a lot of good research on this, but there's some. So like you guys ever seen the starvation study? It's pretty old study. They basically starve people, and we kind of see what that adaptation looks like, et
Mm.
cetera, et cetera.
Mm.
The problem, I think that where I have a difficult time with this, and I'm sure someone that's hardcore on research would get on here and tell me that I'm a fucking idiot, but
Mm.
like I'm just gonna go for this anyhow. I think where I have a hard time is that our population is nearly impossible to study effectively because of the duration of time,
Yeah. Mm.
right? And secondly, is it would probably be an ethical issue to be able to hurt people like this over and over again to yield this result, right? So I think it would be pretty difficult to actually accurately figure out or quantify just how much adaptation and what types of adaptation actually occurs, because we have some case studies on like natural bodybuilders. There were some guys in the US that did it. I think it was out of a lab in Florida. And don't quote me on that. Like Dr. Peter Fitchen, someone that I know here in the States, worked with him a little bit. Essentially, what they did is they did a post-show research. They're like, hey, how fast does it take for our testosterone to come back in natural bodybuilders? Our testosterone and our cortisol and all that stuff. And they kind of noticed, man, it took several months, right? But even then, these were natural pro bodybuilders that probably had a multi-year off season prior to that. They're very seasoned. They probably were relatively adherent post show. So this is like kind of best case scenario stuff. It's like, what's worst case scenario? Like, what
Mhm.
does worst case scenario stuff look like? And these are guys. So like, if you throw females into that, where we have menstrual cycles and we have even a higher susceptibility to adaptation, I think that we have to kind of think about that and realize that we just don't know for sure how much those adaptations can occur and to what degree. And I'm just saying anecdotally, the amount of adaptation that I've seen can be pretty pronounced. And you're going to have other people say, well, they're just not tracking. They're just inaccurately tracking their food. And listen, I get it. I know a lot of people do that, but I would find it hard to believe that in the like hundreds of cases that every single one of those people is not tracking their food correctly. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around that. Like that can't always be the answer.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
especially with some of these people that are extremely neurotic, we're talking like top level OCD,
Yeah.
neuroticism. I just don't think that that's always the case, right? So that's where I fall short on some of the research, but I digress.
Mm. So if I I'm just going to hone in on a specific question I have for you. And to be honest, I'm asking for your opinion for even my benefit here, but it will be interesting. So you've got an individual who has put on that 20 weeks worth of body fat in the 6 weeks, sometimes even less. I'm sure you've seen worse before. I've seen worse.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and you get to that 6 week. Let's just say you get to that 6 week mark for this argument's sake. All right, at that 6 week mark, you would assume that let's just say, to make it a little bit simpler, that they're an enhanced individual, so they're on test replacement therapy. So hormone profile's covered. We assume thyroid is back to function. We assume leptin, ghrelin are back to baseline of where they should be. And then you decide. Obviously, I'm going to assume we have the same position, but typically when I get to this point, I find you can't engage in fat loss phases well enough. But let's just say you're a coach who hasn't dealt with many clients, and you say, okay, we're going to go through a 4 week tidy up to get you into a good spot to start the off season. I'm assuming you observe that in these four, let's say it's a 4 week tidy up, the results, it's like drawing blood from a stone.
It'll do something, but it's not going to do a lot,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
Oh, man, I've given up, and I just say to them when this happens, we ride it out until you're too fat. Yeah.
time. You're going
Yeah.
to have to, at that point, you're essentially playing damage control, and you're trying to either hold maintenance or maybe barely above maintenance for a long enough period of time where you can start getting a response again. It's like you already shot yourself in the foot at that point. And I do think that in some individuals, there probably are cases where we could get away with that 4 week cleanup phase and get something out of it, but it's just not like that's barely going to put a dent in it, at
Yeah.
that point. At that point, probably all that's going to happen is you're going to reduce a little bit of inflammation and fluid that you are retaining, you
Mhm.
know, some glycogen will come back off, but how much body fat are you going to lose when the body's pretty still kind of pissed off, if you will,
Yeah.
right? So obviously the goal would be to avoid that, would be to avoid doing that post show. And that's where we can talk about that a little bit too. And I think that
Mhm.
the from a nutritional aspect, there's a lot of schools of thought here. One school of thought is like don't reverse diet at all because the quicker you get back to baseline calories and body fat, the better. So there's that camp. And then there's the other camp that's like, well, you should go like a low and slow approach. And I really think that the biggest hurdle is probably more psychology than it is physiology in this case. Because physiology, we probably maybe fall somewhere in the middle of those two things. Like we would go fast enough to essentially get those hunger cues under control so we're not binge eating, right? Like who cares if my female client's eating back up to 2,000 calories if she's binge eating 4,000 calories every third day of the week? Like who gives a shit at that point? Doesn't matter, right? But so we would go fast enough to get those hunger cues under control, accrue the body fat that we need, um, and expedite that process. The problem is that, of course, you're going to have different variants in psychology. Some people are going to be super resistant to that. Some people are like, hey, they're very scared of gaining the body fat. They don't want to eat the food, so on and so forth. And then other people just don't give a shit at all. And they're just gonna do whatever they want, and they're gonna end up that guy that we just talked about earlier that's fat 6 weeks post show,
Yeah.
right? And that's the same individual that ends up being that like 4 months after the show starts, they're like getting ready to start my off season. Like, well,
Mhm.
Yeah.
what did we do? Like, what have we
Yeah.
been doing the whole time? So,
It's
so
How,
yeah, there's got to be a middle ground.
I was gonna say, how long do you usually utilize that rebound period to then transition into the off season period? So, like, what would be your time frame for that rebound, and sort of how's your like approach to the recovery aspects, the nutrition aspects to everything?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And my idea on that has changed a little bit over the years. I think there's one, if we don't have any show in sight, let's say we have plenty of time, we have a good amount of time, we're gonna have a productive off season. We have to think about a few things. A is we're probably pretty weak. So getting stronger and increasing performance in the gym should be pretty easy at that point. So I think from a training aspect, we have to remember our nervous system's probably pretty beat up there from the prep, from stimulant use, from training, from all those things. So I would, in most cases, I think we can kind of get the most from the least there and keep our training stimulus pretty low because we should fill out easily at that point. So we should kind of utilize like the lowest effective dose from a training aspect post show, at least initially. And then nutritionally, I would prefer to, I really like to look at hunger cues heavily, because I think what, like I had mentioned earlier, I think that just saying like, hey, I'm going to put you in a 500 calorie surplus or 200 calorie surplus is difficult, because at first, if we just took someone out of the show and we gave them 100 extra calories, guaranteed they're going to binge within 5 days.
Yeah.
Probably,
Yeah.
most likely. So like that doesn't even,
People even still reverse diet though.
right. And that's what I'm saying is like, that's kind of
No one
a,
does
it's
anymore. Yeah.
right. It's like kind of a moot point there. So I think that what we should do is think about, okay, roughly what do we think maintenance is in a healthy state? We know their current maintenance is a window. Maintenance will be based on some adaptation. So their current maintenance is probably going to be slightly lower than their previous maintenance. And then also we have to consider expenditure too. So which of these areas is stressing them out the most? Because if they're coming out of the show and the food's really low, but expenditure is also like they're not doing a lot of cardio, awesome. I don't really need to worry about expenditure too much. I can solely focus on nutrition at that point. But what if they're coming out of the show and expenditure is super high? That's an additional stressor. They're doing interval cardio where they're doing 25,000 steps a day or 30,000 or something obscene. You know what I mean? It's like, shit, I have to get that down, right? Not only from a time perspective and like a neuroticism perspective, because getting in 30,000 steps a day is consuming your entire life, but also it's a stressor. Are steps stressful? Not really, but enough of them are, at some point, it is. So now I think that what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to pull out the biggest stressors first, which to me is probably training and expenditure. So that's, again, take that training load down, probably keep everything at maybe like 65 to 75%, so that somewhere between like 3 to 5 RIR on stuff, assuming they're hard trainers.
Yeah. Do you ever look to reduce like the amount of days they're training opposed to
Yeah,
reducing?
so again, I'm going to kind of go on psychology there, because I think that if I get someone that's like absolutely loves and lives and dies by the gym, and I put them down to 3 days a week, it's going to be tough for them to do it. They're going to be sneaking in extra shit. They're going to be training too hard. They're going to be like pacing around their living room, stressed as hell because they're not at the gym. So I'm really more looking at total volume. If I have to make it 5 days and just spread it out into lower volume chunks throughout the week, that's fine. We'll do it that way.
Yeah.
That's kind of personal preference. Like me personally, I've got other shit to do, so I don't care. I don't care if I train less days in a week.
Yeah.
I'm fine if I'm not in the gym 5 days a week. It doesn't bother me. But some people, they're going to have a hard time with it. So just thinking about how we can spread that out, that as it relates to their psychology. And the same thing with the nutrition. I really want to get them, my first initial 1 or 2 increases are probably going to be relatively big, right out of the gate. I want to get those hunger cues stable. And when I say hunger cues, I think the important thing to remember is like differentiating psychological hunger cues and physical hunger cues. So like your stomach rumbling is that's like a physical hunger cue. A psychological hunger cue would be, hey, I just ate, but I want more food. That's a craving, right? Two different things. The cravings are a much greater indicator of homeostasis than physical hunger cues, because cravings would indicate that your body is telling you something, right? It's like, hey, I want more, even though you just ate. So when we look at psychological hunger cues, whether it's craving like sweets or certain foods, or it's just craving more food overall, that would tell me that we're not at homeostasis yet. And
Yeah.
I get people, dude, that are 3-4 months into the off season and they had a terrible post show diet and they already got fat and they're still craving food. Like, it's like, shit, now like we're in big trouble now. We're going to have to get fatter to get this under control. So, and you see that in obese people too, because we see leptin resistance in obesity, right? So like leptin goes up with body fat and leptin goes up with food to some degree, but there's kind of a point of diminishing return there, where when you get too fat, it starts going the other direction, where your cells become resistant to that leptin. So it's there, but it's not working well. And so it's like, shit, I'm fat and still hungry. Why? Because it's bad, So that's why sometimes when you get to that point, it's difficult. It's really difficult to get hunger under control. And that's why certain drugs like, semaglutide and these GLP-1s and stuff that are out now are so popular in the obesity space, because they essentially make it possible for people that are leptin resistant or have those abnormal hunger signaling to actually lose weight. Yes, willpower and yes, planning and preparation and all those things are definitely the keys. But I think a lot of us also have never been obese, and we don't know what it feels like to be fat and hungry at the same time.
Would
Like
you?
that TV show, My 600-Pound Life. It's a show here in the US. It's like, how in the hell are you still hungry when you weigh 600 pounds? Every cell in your body should be like, please stop eating, but it's not.
Yeah. Do you find though, like on all this, that the psychology comes into play when it comes to the hunger signaling and the, like, I guess, leaning into food? And what I mean by this, if you sort of try to get my point here. So like, for example, we had an overstimulation of, I guess, neurons from a dopamine perspective, through over consuming. Obviously, over time, we're going to require more of a stimulus here. Would you
Yep.
believe that would play a significant role in someone who's obese? Because obviously there would be even more of an inclination, and because they've obviously, you're obese because you've been eating, that would be, I guess, similar to I compare it to some extent. Sorry to cut you off. Just like to, like, not obviously to a drug addict to an extent. It's obviously very extreme of a comparison, but you're still chasing that same relief.
Yeah.
You're 1,000,000% correct. And then we see this in bodybuilders too. I'll give you an example. So when we're in contest prep, we start buying a bunch of shit that we don't need. Why? We're dopamine seeking. Yeah. We're dopamine seeking, right?
I book holidays.
But we do something. We all have a coping mechanism. Like, some people watch the fucking Food Network on TV, whatever it is. Like, we all develop sometimes, hey, if it's not food, that's great, because you're still going to get lean for your show. Like, for me, I recognize this. I've competed enough. I know enough about this science that I have these weird little things that I do in prep that just essentially give me that dopamine that I'm seeking. Like, I get it. Everyone does it. And so the same thing's happening post show, and the same thing's happening, I guess, to anyone. That a drug addict's another example, because again, when you raise, it's like, you don't have enough of it. And then when you get it, your perception of that goes up and up and up. So you need more to attain the same result. Because getting a feeling is two things. One, there's a physiological addiction to something, and then there's also a psychological perception to it, right? So let's say, for example, you did a opiate drug. They say, like, the first, when someone does heroin, they can never replicate that same high again. Is it physiological? Yeah, because there's adaptation to it, but it's also psychological, because their perception to that keeps going down and down. So you need something more extreme to get the same satisfaction. And it's like, so my example for me is, I like cars. I'm into cars. I like fast cars and high horsepower cars. Mm-hmm. If I drive a 700 horsepower car, I'm going to want a 900 horsepower car. It's not because the 700 horsepower car got slower, right? Like, it's not any slower. It's just that I got used to it, essentially, right? So and that's why things become so addictive, because they have physiological properties, but they also become so psychologically addicting at the same time. So it's difficult,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When just to lead back into the one that we were talking about before, when you were saying how post show generally it's like you get the cravings, you get the hunger signaling, both psychologically and physiologically. What are your usual, I guess, battlers for that? Do you sort of just tell the clients, you know what, we just got to ride it out? I know in instances where I've had clients come out of like heavier deficits. Obviously, we begin to taper food back up, but they find that they're or borderline hungrier than what they were during that dieting phase, right? And a lot of the time, I usually just tell them to, in most instances, push protein up, maybe push fiber up, and like I guess electrolyte balance up as well. So push the sodium, potassium a little bit higher. But what do you usually recommend most people do in those instances?
Yeah, and those are great things, changing food selection, trying to create that satiety signal and stuff. I mean, all those things help. I think another thing from the psychological aspect is we need a new coping mechanism because we're done with prep.
Yeah.
So we need to insert something else in there that's healthier, I guess. I mean, healthier, I suppose that's the term we would use. But I see this kind of in all people that have disordered eating or have any of these like abnormal seeking behaviors. I just try to ask people like, what do you enjoy? Like, what are activities that are non-bodybuilding and non-training related that you enjoy? Because we are all guilty of this as bodybuilders. We box ourselves in, you
Yeah.
know, they've been boxed in for 16 weeks, 20 weeks, 24 weeks, like however long, and they haven't been as social. They haven't been doing the other hobbies. Those things kind of got pushed off to the side because A, they didn't have the energy to do them. And B, they were really hyper focused or time. And then they were hyper focused on their prep. So like just reintroducing stuff that they enjoy that will give them some of that dopamine, some of that serotonin that they need is helpful. And you can also, I think a good way to do it is in prep, you should try to really continue. Joe and I had talked about this on a podcast recently, actually. It's like I try to encourage people in prep to live as normal of a life as they can. Like whatever they did before, assuming that they're kind of a full-time bodybuilder that lives that type of thing all year round. It's like, well, if you used to go to to the movies on Friday nights with your wife, keep doing that. So if you enjoyed a certain hobby or something along the way, like don't stop doing it, right? Just continue to do those things. And it does make that post-show period a lot easier because you have outlets.
Yeah.
You have outlets because the only outlet anyone has at that point is just food. They've
Yeah.
been waiting for 5 months or 6 months and thinking about all the freaking food that they're going to eat. They probably have a list. They probably have a bucket list of restaurants in their city that they're going to try to hit over the next 2 months. Like, man, let's make a bucket list of landmarks or something cool or activities that we could do over the next 2 months. Like maybe we should try that instead of making it like food related, you know? So I try to do that with myself too. I think I naturally do it now. I notice that post show, I'm really interested in a lot of things that I'm not normally interested in. And I know it's just because my fucking dopamine levels are like, hey, give me something, help me out here. So, hey, I'm going to try this, or I'm going to try this, or I'm going to try this. We see that in like ADD. We see it in a lot of these impulsive is essentially right. It's kind of impulsive.
Mhm.
But I think that's a good strategy post show that will help a lot of people. And as a coach, maybe we even have to go as far as to actually like assigning activities as part of the plan. Because I think if you make things part of a plan, it's a lot easier to get buy-in from a client. So if I say, hey, I want you to do this thing twice a week as part of your, I don't know, parasympathetic activity, like whatever kind of like bullshit you want to name it. I think you're a lot more likely to get buy-in from that client that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Mhm.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
So
I definitely notice as well when I'm in those phases, I get a lot of obscure interests and a lot of things that I do want to do. And then when the prep wraps up, you don't want to do them anymore.
you're like, oh, okay, we're done.
It's
Yeah.
like it's funny as well. It's like you write this list of places you're going to go, restaurants you're going to go to, whatever it may be, and then you go to like 2 of them, 3 of them, and then that's it. And you have a list of like 30, and then it gets into the next prep, and you're like, why did I never go there? It's like I don't remember that. Like it just gets like
It's you get this, you're kind of, it's almost like you're kind of you get this like grandiosity about things, right? Like in your mind they seem a lot bigger than they are,
Yeah.
you know, like if it's a restaurant or something or whatever it is, and you could go to that same restaurant when you're deep into off season, you're like,
You like what the fuck?
okay, like I don't even I don't give a shit, you know, I don't want to be here anymore. um I just don't want to eat anymore. I'm so sick of food at this point. So but yeah, I think that is a pretty helpful thing post show to kind of trade off some of those coping mechanisms, because also at the same time you probably were using way too many stimulants, you know, you're probably trying to wean off all that shit also. So it's you're basically in about worst case scenario there, you
Yeah.
know.
It's funny. I use too many stimulants all year. With as well with transitioning to the post-show phase with like with PEDs, what would be your sort of approach? Let's just talk, I guess,
Okay.
in regards to anabolics, in regards to lipolytics and
Yep.
thyroid hormone. How would you go about approaching that?
So from a lipolytic standpoint, from fat loss standpoint, I think that we have to remember that that's part of our net calorie balance,
Yeah.
right? So like if we're taking cardio out, adding food, and we take all of our fat loss supplementation out, we're creating a pretty big difference there in calorie balance. I find for most people getting the items that are harsher on your CNS out first are helpful. Getting like and leaving in stuff that's probably not CNS stimulating and phasing that out second. So for example, like getting the clenbuterol out, getting the yohimbine out, getting that stuff out first, and then probably pulling thyroid hormone last in that phase. So maybe over the first, you know, maybe over the first like few weeks, I can really get I can get the stimulant agents out or mostly out of there, besides maybe a little caffeine or something, and then start working on the thyroid after that, or just pull it completely after that. Because one, by that time we've got a little more food in already, right? We're probably getting a little bit better T4 to T3 conversion already at that point. So once we pull that thyroid out, we're going to be able to reboot that access a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
So from a fat loss standpoint, that's kind of my preference, like order of events
And
there.
just quickly before we go on as well, with thyroid, do you do T4, T3, the dual therapy?
Normally,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, normally, yeah.
You pull them at the same time, or would you pull one at one then the
Yeah,
other?
and to be completely honest, I never really go super high with people. I never really
Yeah.
more than like a replacement dose, or
Yeah.
we'll call like a very liberal replacement dose. You know, maybe a little over replacement dose.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely not someone that's given like 100 micrograms of T4 or anything like that to
Mm-hmm.
people. So once we get to that point, so PEDs, man, there's so many different schools of thought here. But my thought process behind that, assuming we have a lot of time, is that again, you should be able to get stronger, fill out so easily with pretty minimal PEDs at that point. So I think a mistake that a lot of people make is that they just switch compounds, or they continue to blast drugs, and then by the time they get fat, that's when they have to come off.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, damn, now we're fat. Now we're fat. We have to go back to cruise, and we're in a bad position. So rather pull them back down to cruise dose, or maybe slightly above cruise dose if we want to leave a little DHT in there, like some Primabulin or Masteron or something like that. But we're probably taking out, the orals, the Trenbolone, all that jazz, and leave them at that, get our rebound. Then by that time, once things start to slow down, once we're kind of out of that like super compensation type of phase, and food's up, health markers are in check, we've already completed that. Like health markers already done. We're good. Labs look good. Bam. Maybe that's like a few months post show. We're not too fat. Now we can start titrating back up our PEDs, and we can continue growing for months and months and months and months. So effectively, we've just initiated a rebound, I guess, or an off-season phase that's where we don't even need to pull into a deficit or do any of that for 6 months or 8 months post show. We've continued to grow, grow, grow. I think and this might not apply to everyone, but I made a goal for a couple of my guys, a couple of my bigger guys especially, and I'm like pulling them down to that lower or we'll call it like maybe a bodybuilder cruise, like slightly above TRT. I'm like, what if we could get you clear up to close to the same body weight you were without before we add anything back in? Then we're going to surpass, like, we're definitely going to surpass baseline. And we've been pretty successful in doing that with several people, with most of my guys post show, is getting them pretty close to where they were at their peak in the last off season, just with food, training, and cleaning up health, digestion, all that stuff. And then we start titrating PEDs up, and we easily eclipse that last set point and grow. So that's not to say that no one's ever gonna, do like a more aggressive rebound phase. I think that you just get to the point where you're getting so much systemic stress on your body by just leaving 2 grams of shit in there for another 3 months after the show. I feel like we're kind of at a point in diminishing return at that point,
Not many. I don't know of many that do that anyway.
Yeah, not anymore.
Yeah.
There probably are some. You'd be surprised.
Yeah.
They're like, hey, we're just going to switch compounds. I'm like, that's not how that works exactly.
Yeah. No. And as well, like just sorry, one of the questions I was going to ask before, so I'm sort of going back a topic as well. I was going to originally say, so if we did back-to-back preps, so obviously we spoke about all the adaptations on the back end of the prep, which make fat loss hard, right? And I've had clients before where they've done back-to-back preps because potentially, obviously you're not going to make any improvements, but you do one show, you're potentially not in the best shape you could be, so you bridge that into another, which is typically about 20 weeks after. And let's just say this was just a general fat loss phase as well for a person who needed to, let's just say I was an obese person who needed to go with multiple fat loss phases, because obviously you're not going to sit in the deficit for 50 weeks straight. Do you find that these adaptations are inhibitory of having that second stint being optimized or even just being efficacious at all?
Yeah, because we don't have a lot of time there, right? That's, it's difficult to say. I think that I think the answer would probably be, in most cases, no. And mainly for the fact that we probably didn't get them into too big of a hole in that first go around, right? Now prep might be a little bit different, but if we're looking at obese people especially, I actually kind of do that intentionally with a lot of obese people. And I'll give you an example. So like, let's say that they need to lose 100 pounds. Okay. Do I want to push them this complete 100 pounds like linearly the whole way through? And the answer to that is normally no. Because what I find is that from a health marker standpoint, we know like their lipid profile, their blood glucose, insulin levels, like all that stuff will improve by losing weight for sure, no doubt. But losing 100 pounds straight is a hell of a lot of time in a calorie deficit. At that point, it's more of a time issue. So I almost do prefer to actually break things up like that into chunks intentionally. Maybe lose half of what we need to lose, then take a break, lose the rest. And I don't mean like a 1 week diet break. I mean like a couple months, a few months in between, and then lose the rest. Prep's a little bit different just because, yeah, maybe you weren't in your best shape for the first show, but you're still still in pretty good shape, so I'd almost be inclined to say, hey, like, could we do a show that's in 8 weeks from now instead of 20? I would rather map it out that way where we can just basically just keep going, maybe take like a 1 week diet break there, refeed, something like that, and then finish it. Because when we start to, I call that kind of no man's land, we start to get into that, 4 to 5 month time frame. It's like almost, it's not enough to fix everything, but it's also like too much time to keep them out of a surplus, So maybe trying to group those things closer together would be more effective.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Or maybe because if you had that down reg, you'd have difficulties around.
And you see it. So
Yeah.
I like I think examples help people kind of visualize this stuff. You see it in pro, like you see in a lot of pros that compete all year long, they deteriorate by the last show. You know, it's like first show, maybe they're not quite peaked. Second, third show, you're like, ah, there it is. They're good, they're hard, they're dry. Then
Mm.
they start getting worse. You know, they maybe didn't peak at the beginning, and then they lost a little more, they got a little harder, they peaked. Because I think a lot of people are like, well, they just didn't dry out enough for the first show. I'm like, nah, they just had a little more body fat to lose, and they took more time and they lost it for show two.
Mm.
But by the time the Olympia comes around, like, man, they were way worse than they were in the Texas Pro or the whatever
Yeah.
earlier this year. It's like, well, yeah, dude. I mean, they've been blasted 3 grams of gear for 10 months, and they have hardly had any time out of a deficit. They're deteriorating at that point, you know?
Yeah, I've always wondered
So,
how the upliners go about that actually. So I'm assuming they just go at it all year.
I don't want to assume what everyone's doing because I just don't know. I only know what I know. I only know from, my experiences and the other individuals I've talked to. But I would say that there probably are a large majority of them that probably do just keep they just stay at that extremely high super physiological level the whole freaking time.
Mm.
Um, so you can only imagine what that's doing from an adaptation standpoint eventually,
Cool.
rather than just maybe positioning. And I get it. Like, I get it. They're professionals a lot. Maybe they're not good enough to win their pro qualifier, so they have to point their way in,
Mm.
at least with the way the system was for the longest time. So they have to do it. Or it's the same thing in the national scene here in the US. We have a lot of national shows. You get guys that'll start at USA's in, July, I believe it's July, and then they don't get it. Then they go to North Americans in September. They don't get it. Then they go to nationals in December. And by nationals, one of two things going to happen. Either A, they're pushed way back because they look like shit, or the judges just give it to them because they're tired of seeing them there.
Yeah.
They're like,
Mm.
just, all right, he's good. Just get him out of here.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. One of the ones that I always found more difficult in observing, like not observing, I just found a little bit more confusing was when the females do the shows back to back to back to back. Because obviously the deployment of PEDs becomes a little bit of a, it's almost you look at it and you're like, what do they do? Do you know what I mean?
yeah, I think most of them, well, I think the difference in females too is that the exposure is so much lower, right?
Mm.
So because females, most of the adaptation in females is going to be from, like, they're more worried about like virilization issues than they are like their I mean, does it affect their lipid profiles and their renal function? Yeah, a little bit,
Mm.
but they're not going to see like an HDL of 3 like you see it in some of these guys.
Yeah.
You're not really seeing that. But from a metabolic standpoint, for sure, they're still going to have adaptation. But that's also why I think if people just stopped and looked around, like, let's look at genetically elite people are different because they also can get leaner easier than a lot of people. So that's maybe not a great example. But if we looked at like a national level competitor, so we looked at someone that had pretty average genetics that was trying to hit that national scene, like bam, 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 trying to get that pro card, their shelf life is short.
Mm.
If they finally get that pro card after killing themselves for 2 years, half of them never compete as a pro. Half of them fall off the face of the earth because they're so damn screwed up that they're just in a hole that they're never going to pull themselves out of. They hate bodybuilding. They're like, I'm tired of doing this. I hate it. My body's screwed up. I feel like shit, you know? So we just don't see a lot of longevity in females except for some of the more genetically elite women.
Mm-hmm.
But on the local scene and the regional scene, dude, they drop like flies. It's like new people all the time.
Yeah.
Like half of them don't compete more than a few years, and they're gone. They're out.
Yeah.
Mm.
What's
So
your competitive season going to look like next?
This will probably be my last question because I get on the next call.
Yeah.
um,
That's good. I thought I
my
got
com- what was the
to
question?
close everyone. Yeah. When
What
was
was the question?
what's your competitive stint look like upcoming?
It's a good question. I did nationals. I did NPC nationals in 22, so about a little over a year ago. It was in December of 22. So that was kind of my litmus test because when I did it. I'm like, one of two things going to happen. I'm either A, going to get the shit kicked out of me, and that's it. I'm never going to be good enough to do this. Or because I've been competing for a while, I'm not delusional. Like, I'm not going to put on 40 pounds of tissue at this point in my career. Right. So I thought, okay, if I do good enough, if I can crack like top 10, top five, that's enough for me to warrant, continuing and doing it again. Because I was a light heavyweight, which is 198 pounds. So that's what? I don't know, like 90
Under 90.
kilos.
Yeah, under 90. Yeah.
Yeah. So for one, NPC Nationals is super competitive and light heavyweight is so deep because like everyone falls in that weight class.
Who won?
I think I had
Who won light
30
heavies?
guys. What's that?
Who won light heavies that year?
I don't know. I don't remember the guy's name, to be honest with you. He was good though. Yeah, he was good. And yeah, there's like 30 guys in the damn class. It's wild. It's so tough. But I did good. I got seventh, I think, out of whatever 30 people. I don't know what it was, something like that. So I'm like, all right, we're we're gonna keep going. So for me, one of two options. I've had a lot of life transitions going on this year. So if everything smooths out the way that I want it to, nationals at the end of the year is a possibility. I'm not taking that off the table. Now, if that doesn't happen, I'll be 34 this year, but next year I'll be 35. So I'm like masters. I don't give a shit. I have no ego. I'm going to masters and we're going to do masters nationals after that.
Yeah.
If we don't get it in the open. And I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, you got a masters pro card. I'm like, I'll take my masters pro card. I don't give a
Yeah.
shit.
Pro card.
I'll take it. I'll take it because I think if I can achieve that, that's probably it. I'm
Yeah.
too tall for 212. Like I'm too tall for 212.
Mm.
I'll and there's an open is ridiculous. Like open is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's just and at 35, I'll be 35 by then. At 35 years old, been bodybuilding since I was 16. Like what am I gonna do? Like
Mm.
I'm pretty much gonna be tapped out on resources at that point.
Yeah.
So that's fine.
Still,
That's
right?
okay. That's still a pretty hard thing to achieve. I would be very proud of that. If I can achieve that, I will gladly just hang up the posing trunks and call
Yeah.
it a day.
Yeah. Seventh is still good out of that lineup because, like, even 2022, the lineup for just even the overall lineup for that year was still pretty good because that was the year Carlos Thomas won it, wasn't it? 22.
I can't remember who won the overall. No, the heavyweight won the overall that year. I don't remember his name.
I thought Carlos won at 22. Oh, no. Carlos won 21, didn't he?
Yeah, I think the heavyweight won the overall that year.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, nationals is US. So US national shows, we have more of them and we have more opportunities for pro cards, but the depth is like far and above everywhere else
Yeah.
in the US. The depth is tough. I always find it kind of amusing when the Canadian guys come down to do North Americans and they're like second at Canadian nationals and they get like 15th at North Americans. Like,
Yeah.
hey, welcome.
It's funny. It's like that'd be like even the people that win their pro cards here in our shows for the amateur shows because it's like what they give out for open, they give out 2 a year in Australia, right? Uh,
Tough.
if they went to North Americans, they'd be like 25th. Like
No,
Yeah, it's tough.
no pros
Not all of them.
were.
Yeah.
some of the older ones, there's no like newer ones that have gone pro that are like out of this world.
Yeah, and you do get a few people. I mean, like, Europe's had some good guys that have come out that have been pretty competitive
Yeah.
at the scene. Of course, like Hadi, of course, Middle Eastern. So There's an example. But I think if I'm thinking historically, we go back Dorian Yates, obviously, but we had Cutler, Coleman, Phil Heath, Dexter Jackson, Sean Roden.
Mm.
It's mostly Americans.
Yeah, they just do well.
Yeah, for the most part.
The weaker pool here is actually probably the men's physique.
Mm.
It's a weak pool
Yeah.
in this country. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no
Men's
really.
physique.
Mhm.
You do see like a lot more ethnic diversity in those classes, I feel. In
Yeah.
men's physique and classic physique, even you see a lot more ethnic diversity, bikini, figure, basically like everything but open bodybuilding.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, sweet. Well,
Cool,
thanks.
guys.
We appreciate you coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I appreciate you having me.
Scheduling, but do you have anything you want to plug? Any services, anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So
Programs?
easiest way to reach me on Instagram, I am Austin ST8 on Instagram. I have a link tree in my bio. So the link tree will take you to like my email's in there for any inquiries for services, any other news and stuff I have going on is all found in the link tree. So if you want to inquire about consultations, coaching mentorship for education, classes, all the stuff that I offer, just email me or check that link tree. Everything's there.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you.
Again, really appreciate it.
I appreciate it, guys. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Me too. Enjoy your night.
Thanks, guys.